Hi, everybody, and welcome to my channel. I'm Jenny Gage, and this is Life Take 2, where I share my escape from Mormon tradwife life. I recently posted a video about being shunned by my Mormon family and being alone at Christmas time with my partner and our kids. And I had so much outreach and so many questions that I wanted to do a little follow-up. So welcome to part 2 of Shunned by my Mormon family at Christmas, where I share the origin story, which is my dad's story. My dad was born in the 1940s to a couple who hadn't known each other for very long and would divorce by the time he was 4 years old. He has a really sad story that he used to tell me in his childhood of the very last time that he saw his dad. He was maybe kindergarten age, attending a private Catholic school, and his dad, who was an alcoholic and had just had so many problems in his life, came up to the gate of the school to try to see his son and was escorted off the property. And my dad talked about seeing him through the gates and just crying and wanting his dad. He would never see him again. My grandma's no longer alive, so I don't really have the ability to ask her all the details of the time that she spent with my granddad. But I know that it must have been hard for her to go into hiding, which is what she did. She would change my dad's last name as quickly as she could and keep him from his father for the rest of his life. And unfortunately, her second marriage, though really happy for herself, was a little bit abusive towards my dad. His stepdad had shell shock, which is our modern day PTSD from, I believe, World War I, had been raised in an orphanage and had never seen any type of pattern of any sort of healthy family behavior. So my dad has some fairly horrific stories of neglect and child abuse at the hands of his stepdad. And so my dad left home at age 17 to make his own way in the world, get away from the abusive stepdad, and would eventually end up in the post-World War II German occupation army. Here's something that will probably jump out at you right away as being really sad. I really don't know much about anything that happened in my dad's life prior to me being born, because his life before joining the Mormon church was almost sort of a dirty little secret. So I know that a couple times in my life he talked about being in Germany, but then he would talk about going to a beer garden and my mom would give him this eye and he would just zip it and not give me any more details. And I know that he had a couple of old slides, and a time or two in my life he did a slideshow showing him standing by the Eiffel Tower or on the streets in Rome or in Spain running with the bulls. But then inevitably a slide would drop in and on the screen would be a picture of girls at the Moulin Rouge. And then my mom would stop the slideshow and say, "That's enough." So I don't really know much about my dad's life before me. What I do know is he spent 5 years in the Army and then came back to America and used the GI Bill to go to college. And while he was going to college, Portland State University, he would bump into a Mormon girl, fall in love, and I can imagine that her big Mormon family seemed really exciting and comforting, having come from a home with a single mom who was struggling to get by and then the addition of an abusive stepdad. I know that this girl had a bunch of brothers and sisters, and I've even kind of been in the neighborhood where she used to live when my dad was dating her. And she would tell my dad that she couldn't continue dating him if he didn't look into the Mormon gospel. My dad came from strong German Lutherans and Southern Baptists on the two sides of his family. And Mormonism was really frowned on by his mom and everybody in his life, pretty much. But the love that he felt with this girl's family and the connection that they had was enough to entice him to attend a Mormon Institute class through Portland State University, where he learned about the restoration of the gospel and Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon. And in the 1960s, when there was no Google and he had no way to really research stuff, he fell hook, line, and sinker for all of the stories and the love and the good vibes. So my dad, as a young veteran, gets baptized into the Mormon church. And then eventually this girl would break up with him and he would marry somebody else, although I would not know that detail until I was a 40-something-year-old woman. That is a story for another video. And the couple conversations that I have had with my dad about his conversion to the Mormon church were this. he had, on the one hand, a lot of love and support. He was a good-looking, really hard-working, interesting convert. And I'm sure that the Mormon ward and the people around him were really excited that they had baptized him. But then on the other hand, it was really devastating news to his Lutheran mom that he had joined the Mormons, which she believed to be a cult. So it created both the love and acceptance of the Mormon community and the separation from his own mom. And unfortunately, my dad's first marriage would end really suddenly, and he decided to go to BYU. He actually wrote a poem about the martyrdom of Joseph Smith, which won him a scholarship to BYU. So that, combined with the GI Bill, made it really accessible for him to go off to college. And he has shared with me a little bit the excitement that he felt being on that campus in the 1960s, and all of these young Mormon kids that were building up the kingdom of Zion and creating this fresh, sin-free college environment in the middle of all kinds of things like the civil rights movement and the sexual revolution, women's lib, etc. Vietnam was raging around them, and my dad was on the squeaky cleanest, most wholesome campus in the world. And it was at BYU that he would meet my mom. And one of the problems with meeting somebody at college is that you don't know a lot of their background and you don't have context for each other. So they fell in love at college, my mom not realizing, as a multi-generational Mormon, what she was getting into with my dad's family, where he was a fresh convert full of Lutherans and Baptists, and my dad not having any idea what he was getting into with his multi-generational Mormon family from Scottsdale, Arizona. So my mom and dad would get married in the Mesa, Arizona temple. And just over a year later, I would come along. And I remember as a child, my dad always acting very resistant to the Mormon church. For instance, we would be reading the scriptures together as a family at night, and my mom would open up a passage from the Book of Mormon. And I remember my dad grabbing the Book of Mormon, throwing it across the living room and saying, "You said we're not going to read any Book of Mormon scriptures with the kids." I didn't understand what that tension was all about. I just chalked it up to him being a convert and the pressure that he probably had from his mom to come back to the Lutheran church and not belong to the Mormon church anymore. I also just thought that Satan was tempting my dad, and I really didn't understand what was going on. I would not understand what was going on until 6 years ago, when I had a faith crisis and left the Mormon church. My kids accidentally told my mom that I was no longer Mormon just a weekend. I was pushed out of the Exmo closet very abruptly, and my mom started telling everybody, obviously my dad and my siblings and aunts and uncles, and I'm sure all of the neighbors and probably the checker at Trader Joe's down the street from her house, that her daughter had left the Mormon church. And one day when my mom was at the grocery store or something, I would get a phone call from my dad 6 years ago. And he would tell me, "Jenny, I need to tell you a little bit of my background that will probably help explain a lot of your childhood. And I want you to know right off the bat that I'm proud of you, because I know firsthand how hard it is to leave this church." I still remember like every detail of what was going on in the kitchen while I was standing there FaceTiming my dad. And he started to give me all of the backstory and details behind my life, probably looking over his shoulder the whole time, waiting for my mom's car to pull into the driveway when he knew that he'd have to stop spilling the beans. Here's what my dad told me. He had a true, sincere, deep testimony of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, went to BYU full of enthusiasm for the gospel, met and fell in love with my mom, and saw this as my chance to build the family that I never had. They loved each other deeply, and he was really enthusiastic about the gospel and the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and all of this stuff. So they get engaged and they go to the Mesa, Arizona temple. And in preparation for the wedding, there are all of these different things that you go through first. This happened in 1973, where there was no internet. There was no way for my dad to have in any way been prepared for what he was about to experience. And as he went through all of the culty stuff that happens inside of the Mormon temple, he freaked. He told me that when he got to the part where he had to take his thumb and act out slitting his own throat, ripping out his intestines, and he had to take an oath that I would rather feed my organs and bowels to the beasts of the field and the birds of the air then do anything that would in any way compromise these temple covenants that I've made. I don't remember the exact verbiage, but it's available online everywhere. He said when he went through that, I would rather than ever betray the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He said in that moment, I wanted to walk out. I didn't realize that I had joined a cult. And right there, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. So he did go through the rest of everything that happened in the temple that day. And then they had their temple sealing at the very end of all of that. And my dad also got the naked rub down in the washings and anointings, just like I had in 1995. And that didn't sit right with him at all. So what my dad told me was after the wedding and all of the photos and talking to family and everything, they got out to the car. And my dad says that he turned to my mom and said, "This is a cult. What in the world just happened?" So my dad lost his testimony in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints that he had just gotten baptized into, I don't know, a handful of years before that, at his wedding with a woman that he very much loved, who believed very much that the church was 100% true. I wish I'd known that I wasn't going to have any further conversations with my dad for years to come, because I have so many unanswered questions. He shared with me in just a few sentences why, for all of my childhood, he had been a fake Mormon. He said, they went off to the wedding reception and went on their honeymoon. And he said, I just kind of feel like your mom chalked it up to the fact that Satan was testing our new marriage. But I was out and never wanted to be part of the Mormon church again. But I was also with a woman that I loved. And then eventually kids would come along. And he said, I just decided to do what I had to do to keep this family. There wasn't a Sunday of my life that my dad wasn't dressed in his sports coat and his white shirt and his tie and his trousers, getting the kids ready and driving us down in the Mormon church. There wasn't a baby blessing that he wasn't at. There wasn't a baptism that he wasn't at. Although it does make a lot of sense now why he took my 8-year-old son aside and told him, hey, if you don't want to get baptized in this church, you don't have to. I actually came around the corner in my hallway and heard him talking to my 8-year-old and freaked out. I chalked it up to dementia. I didn't realize, I had no idea that my dad hadn't believed in the Mormon church for 50 years of his life. And I wish that I could have the conversation with him, and I wish that he was mentally sound enough to take me back to that time in his life. I wish I knew, was it just that he loved my mom? Was it the fear of being alone? He didn't know how to leave. Divorce was so frowned on. He loved me and my siblings. What kept him acting like he was Mormon when he wasn't for literally 5 decades of his life? I have no idea. But on that day that he found out that I had left the Mormon church, and he called and FaceTimed me, he just shared a couple sentences, and he told me, I've wanted to tell you for decades that the Mormon church is absolutely, certainly not true, and that I had never believed it, that your mom was the one who made us go to church and made you go to seminary and made you go in and talk to the bishop and made you go to a church college and try to get your brothers to go on missions. That was all your mom. That was not me. And so every chance he got for the next little bit, my dad would call me on the phone whenever my mom was away, and he'd just check in with me. I was going through a brutal divorce at that point, just 2 weeks after leaving the Mormon church. My marriage would collapse. And he was really proud of me when I started going to a Christian church. And I remember when I got my first job, how he couldn't even talk. There's just silence on the other end. And then I realized that he was crying. And he's like, Jennifer, I'm so sorry. I'm just so proud of you for building a life for your kids. I'm so proud of you for getting a job. And I'm so excited to see what you do with your life. And then when I met Kevin and I would call him multiple times a week. My dad really is just an older version of Kevin. They say you marry your dad. I certainly fell in love with a younger version of him. And Kevin and my dad are both German Lutherans. And my dad would call me and tell me about scriptures that he was reading and things where he was following my Christian Bible study. And I felt like I connected with my dad more in just that few months after leaving the church than I ever had in my entire life. Then things started to get kind of wonky because my mom realized that I was compromising my dad's testimony, which he didn't really have, compromising her control over him, and that she could no longer triangulate me against this man. I remember one of the most explosive conversations that we had was when I called to tell my dad that I was getting rid of my monster of an ex-husband's last name, and I was taking not my maiden name, that would have been my mom's last name, but my dad's birth name from my granddad, who hadn't seen his son since age 4 or 5. So my last name, Gage, was my granddad's name, who was lost to us. He passed away, by the way, when my dad was, I think, in the army. And my dad hadn't even been informed. He didn't know. We would find that out years later, and I would go with my dad to the cemetery and stand at his father's grave. And I knew in that moment that if I ever had the opportunity to take that man's name and heal that little wound in my dad's life, that I would. And I did. And I called my dad and I told him, I know that you've never had the opportunity in your life to change your name from your abusive stepdad's name back to the name of your birth father, but I'm going to be the first one in this family to do it for you. And again, my dad was so choked up, he could hardly speak. And my mom was on the other phone and she was freaking out and like, this is just stupid. This is bullshit. I don't understand why you're doing it. And I don't honestly understand why she was so angry about. And that's the main reason why I will never change my last name. Even should my partner and I decide to get married, I will always carry the name that my dad was unable to carry in his life for my grandpa Gage. Also, at some point, my dad would tell me that he was being forced to go to Mormon church all the time. And I told him over the phone, I said, Dad, you are an 80-year-old man. You have permission to quit the Mormon church if you want to, and I will help you resign. And I began that process for him. I don't know if it was completed or not. I wouldn't have gotten the notification. The letter would have gone to his house, which could have been a reason why my mom disowned me. And from that time forward, I had a conversation with my mom and I said my dad would like to participate in the religion that he chooses. And I started sending him little links for Lutheran sermons during the pandemic when everybody was broadcasting church. And he would send me little responses telling me thank you so much and telling me things about the sermon that had really touched him. My dad, by the way, is 82 years old. And he has all kinds of physical problems, not all of which I need to discuss on social media, but he is both physically and mentally unable to care for himself, live an independent life, and he doesn't have a cell phone or a device or any way for me to contact him. And as my relationship with my mom got more and more strained and she disowned me, she then cut off all contact with my dad. So the letter that I read all the time, that was about my mom controlling my contact with my dad. She leads literally with, don't come to the state of Oregon to see your dad. You may never see him again in your life. While the betrayal and rejection of my whole huge extended family disowning me is painful, I only care because I want to see my dad before he dies. The last time I ever saw my dad was 6 years ago before I left the Mormon church.